I saw a TikTok where someone was asked a simple question. Where is the line between the working class and the middle class? And they struggled to answer it. Not because it's some deeply complicated question, but because it's actually a bad question. It's like asking, where is the line between Celsius and Fahrenheit? You're mixing two different paradigms and then wondering why it doesn't make sense. A lot of this confusion comes from the fact that pop culture blends together different frameworks. You'll hear people casually using terms like working class, which predates Karl Marx but was absorbed into Marxist theory, right alongside terms like middle class, which comes from a completely different way of thinking. So let's untangle these paradigms. Marx describes class in terms of your relationship to production. In his framework, you've got the bourgeoisie who own capital and the proletariat who sell their labor. The key thing is, class here is not based on income or lifestyle. It's entirely about your role in the production process. So take someone like a software engineer making $200,000 a year at a big tech company. Marx would still classify that person as working class because they don't own the company. They're selling their labor. And it gets even stranger when you realize that under this framework, a highly paid CEO and a low-wage worker are treated as fundamentally the same class, while a small business owner struggling to stay afloat can be placed on the opposite side of the divide simply because they technically own capital. The categories start to feel detached from reality. As Ludwig von Mises emphasized, this way of thinking tends to flatten the economy into a kind of static conflict that ignores the dynamic roles of entrepreneurship, risk-taking, and coordination. It treats capitalist and worker as fixed identities in a struggle rather than roles within a consistently shifting market process. It also assumes that interests within these classes are unified and opposed, when in reality, individuals within these so-called classes often have wildly different incentives and time preferences. The idea that millions of people can be meaningfully grouped into two opposing camps with a single shared interest is a massive oversimplification. And because the framework is built around conflict, it tends to interpret all economic relationships through that lens, even when those relationships are voluntary and mutually beneficial. What most people are actually using in everyday conversation is an income-based model of class. This is less a real theory and more a sorting mechanism. People are grouped into lower, middle, and upper class based on income, lifestyle, maybe education, and maybe consumption patterns. In that framework, our software engineer is not called working class. They have a high income and a comfortable lifestyle, and so they get labeled middle class or upper middle class. Same person, completely different answer. So when people are using working class to mean lower class, they're mixing paradigms and using Marxist rhetoric, likely without knowing it. The problem with the income-based model is that it doesn't really explain anything. It just describes where people fall on a spectrum. It tells you where people are, but not the processes that put them there. And the boundaries between classes are completely arbitrary. What counts as middle class shifts depending on where you live and what year it is, and who you ask. So when someone tries to draw a hard line between lower class and middle class, they're asking for precision that just isn't there. But there's a deeper way to look at this, and it asks a different question entirely. Instead of focusing on what you earn or what you own, it asks whether your income comes from production and voluntary exchange or from coercion and extraction. This is the libertarian framework, developed by thinkers like Frederick Bastiat and Murray Rothbard. Here, class isn't about income or production rules, it's about coercion. The distinction is between people who create wealth through voluntary exchange and people who extract wealth through force, fraud, or threat of force. The classes are therefore called producers and predators or parasites. What makes this framework different is that it applies the same rule to everyone. It doesn't matter how much money you make or what your job title is. The question is whether your actions are voluntary or coercive, and that standard doesn't change depending on your group identity. So if you take a government bureaucrat earning $60,000 a year, the Marxist and the income-based model would tend to place them somewhere in the working or middle class, respectively. But in the libertarian framework, if their role involves redistributing resources through coercion, then they fall on the predatory side. On the other hand, a billionaire entrepreneur who earns his wealth through voluntary transactions would be classified a producer. This completely cuts across the usual rich versus poor narrative. Now take something like a mafia boss. In the Marxist framework, what matters is their relationship to production, not the fact that they're using violence and coercion in an obvious literal sense. So you end up with this strange situation where the actual enforcers, the hired muscle carrying out intimidation and violence, still can be framed as workers and victims simply because they're selling their labor even though that labor consists of coercion. In an income-based model, it's simpler. They're just upper class if they're wealthy, maybe elite. But again, that tells you nothing about what they're actually doing. In the libertarian framework, everything snaps into focus immediately. The mafia boss is a predator, full stop, because their wealth is derived from force and the threat of force rather than voluntary exchange. And this is where the framework shows its consistency because it doesn't suddenly change its standards when the coercion is legalized. The same principle that classifies the mafia boss as predatory also applies to the politician who uses state power to extract resources. Which means the distinction isn't about titles or legislation, it's about whether force is being initiated. Marxists define class in terms of conflict and position within what they erroneously see as a historical struggle. The income-based model defines it in terms of earnings and status. The libertarian framework defines it in terms of coercion and voluntary interaction. And if you're looking for a framework that applies consistently, that doesn't shift with arbitrary income brackets, and that actually tells you something about the moral structure of society, the libertarian approach is the one that holds together. Because in the end, class isn't about how much money you make or what you own, it's about whether your relationships with people are voluntary or not.